Welcome back, everybody. So, been very excited to wait for this session where we'll have the 6 winning abstracts for each theme. And I'm happy to say that we had a pretty robust competition with 96 abstracts. So I'd like to announce the first winner in the category Decision Support and Hospital Monitoring is Matthew Komorowski. Matthew?
Is this working? Yeah. Well, good morning. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
We'll keep it quick.
Okay. I don't have to carry. Okay. Morning. Obviously, I want to thank the meeting committee and the reviewers, but above all, I want to thank whoever upgraded me to the executive suite with ocean view. Thank you. Thank you for that. My name is Matthew Komorowski. I'm an intensive care physician. I'm doing a PhD in machine learning at Imperial College, and I'm visiting Leo Salli's lab at MIT at the moment. So what I care about is applied problems. I want my research to make an impact on patients. A key problem in intensive care is sepsis. So many patients have sepsis, over a third of them, and it's the main cause of death in intensive care. One of the key challenges when treating sepsis is the management of intravenous fluids and vasopressors. So the approach we've taken is using reinforcement learning to try to address this problem. Objective 1, can we model the prescription of those drugs using a Markov decision process? Objective 2, can we solve this Markov decision process and identify what are the most optimal actions that will improve patient survival? So I've used a completely data-driven approach. I've extracted a cohort of patients from MIMIC, a cohort of patients with sepsis, nearly 20,000 of them, and defined all the different elements of an MDP. I want to make a parallel between reinforcement learning and medicine. In reinforcement learning, we deal with the issue of having an agent acting in an environment. The environment is going to switch, transition into different states, and release a reward or a penalty, depending on how good the action was. So that's a bit abstract. Let me give you maybe a simpler illustration. Let's think about this example. That's a grid world. It's composed of different states. The agent is the rat, and the rat wants to get to the cheese as often as possible, and he wants to avoid being electrocuted. So the objective of the rat is to find the best policy, the best decisions that will lead him to cheese more often than being electrocuted, hopefully. An important quantity we need to define is the Q value. So the Q value is the state action value function. It's a numerical value that tells you how good an action A, while taken in a state S, is. Going back to medicine, basically it's the same problem. Medicine is about having a physician act on a patient by means of different interventions, drug prescriptions, for example. The patient is going to transition into different states, clinical states, and if the patient gets better, if its mortality risk gets lower, then the physician gets a reward. So using this framework, we can ask 2 questions. What is the physician's policy? What is the Q value of their action? And second question, can we identify an optimal policy? Going back to the grid world, this time we have a patient here. He can either go home or go to the cemetery, and the challenge is to find the right decisions. It's that simple. Moving back to the results, so here on the left, what you see is the relationship between the Q value of physicians and the risk of mortality. And as expected, here on the left, low Q values are associated with high risk of mortality. High Q values are more optimal actions, low risk of mortality. I've plotted 2 circles representing the mean Q value of physicians in blue and the mean Q value of optimal actions in green. What you see is that the difference is quite large. In terms of difference in expected mortality, it's over 40% reduction in mortality if the most optimal actions are taken all the time for patients with sepsis. And this is according to the model. So if we translate that in terms of lives saved, it's huge. Several tens of thousands of lives annually, according to the model. On the right, on your right, you see the distribution of the Q values of physicians against the Q values of optimal actions. And what this shows you is that 94% of the time, the Q values of optimal actions are higher than the Q values of physicians. So most of the time, the action taken by physician is not the best one. There are better decisions to be made. Next question is obviously a really obvious one. How do we test this? How can you test a decision support system when there's no gold standard? Obviously, physicians are not the gold standard. What I've done is I looked at a test set of subjects, looked at the dose of drug that they were actually receiving, looked at what dose they would have received if we had followed the optimal policy, and then I compute the difference between those two doses. And I plot this against the actual mortality of patients in the test set. So what you see here on the left for intravenous fluids, on the right is vasopressors. At 0, in the middle here, 0 means that the patients actually received the optimal dose. Does that make sense? What you see is that at 0, the mortality is the lowest. So the most optimal actions, according to the decision support system, are actually associated with the lowest possible mortality in the test set. The further away you go from 0, so the more wrong the physicians were, the more the patient died. There's dose-effect relationship for both drugs. So overall, these are some somewhat robust results, really promising. I'm going to conclude here. The beauty of using reinforcement learning in a problem like this, I think, is threefold. One, this is precision medicine. The patient only gets what he needs. Number two, using reinforcement learning, you don't need to define a resuscitation target. This is something we're probably bad at. We rely on optimizing blood pressure, urine output, lactate. Reinforcement learning doesn't do that. Reinforcement learning optimizes an outcome, optimizes mortality directly. Number three, by using reinforcement learning, you're able to balance short-term versus long-term benefit. And this is something that's extremely hard to do with a patient at the bedside, and most physicians simply fail to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nicely done. Very nice work. And now questions.
Yeah, great job, Matt. I was wondering, have you actually applied this in an ICU setting in terms of what are, after all the math, what do doctors or nurses do from this?
So are you talking about validating this in a clinical setting?
Yes, like as a clinical decision support tool, has it actually been deployed and adopted in a clinical setting? And do you have like a case study or a clinical example of the specific dosing recommendation that resulted from it?
This is a really obvious question. The answer is not yet. This is my PhD work. We're going to proceed with several validation steps. You cannot obviously apply this, test this on a patient before having more evidence. So we're going to be testing this on external data sets, see how the model holds in the US, in the UK, and then before proceeding to some careful clinical testing.
Hi. Very nice. Thank you. When do you envision this feedback being given to the physician or the clinician?
Well, it's kind of related to the previous question. We need more evidence before being allowed.
But no, I'm sorry. I mean, at the point of care, or is this retrospective as an education tool, or is it during the actual care or prior to the case?
So the objective is to influence the physicians when making decisions. So
okay,
this
so
would
real
be used
time.
In real time at the bedside. Typically, you would need to integrate this model directly into the EMR. It relies on over 50 variables. You cannot be entering this manually every time you want an answer. So the idea is to integrate this in the workflow, sort of as a pop-up or a side information.
Great, thank you.
Very nice, well done. When we bring new interventions to the world, we usually try and compare against the gold standard. And in your case, this looks like a classic control system problem. bang control or something like that. So have you thought about, when you do your evaluation, not just showing that you make a difference, but that the use of learning in this way actually improves on well-known classic methods for control?
So your question is about evaluating this? Can you rephrase it?
Well, another way of saying it is that you're proposing that this learning method is the way to get optimal control. But there are classic ways of doing this that don't rely on this. And the classic way would be natural control theory. So it might be looking at that as a comparator. So it's great to get a paper in a journal saying this does well, but we like to know that are you actually improving on the state of the art?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a good suggestion, obviously. I'm not sure exactly how we could proceed, but I'm happy to discuss this after the talk.
Again, very nice work.
Thank you.
So one of the features of your model had to do with the fact that this was physiologic data that happened over time, and time was a part of your model. Kind of two questions related to that. One could assume that you took a point in time and used the previous time values. I saw a 4-hour denominator, milliliters of fluid per 4 hours. And then you compared that against what the computer recommended versus what the physician actually had going on. And it was the delta that you compared against, and you showed that when the two matched, that was the lowest mortality. So the question is, did you repeat this multiple times for different epochs? And if so, did you reset in between each epoch to a new baseline, or did you use the previous recommendation moving forward? Do you understand the question?
So it relies on a MDP, so we confirmed that the chain was memoryless. That's one part of the answer. So you don't rely on the information from previous states to make the recommendation at time t. The information of the past doesn't matter in a Markov model. So that's one part of the answer. The other one is we used 4 hours. Sort of a trade-off between availability of data, missing data, and clinical significance. I've tried the model with 2 hours or 6 hours. It doesn't. I mean, everything still holds. 4 hours was sort of a trade-off between all those constraints.
Very good. Well done.
Thank you very much. Another question? We've done 10 seconds.
How many patients did you have data for to validate the model?
So in this model, it's 19,449. I use 80%. In each model, I build the MDP on 80% of the data, train on 20. I repeat that over and over again until I have reached the result.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. In the category of medical imaging and biomedical diagnostics, we have Danny Eaton. It's hard to be a rock star, huh?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Hi, my name is Danny Eitan. I'm a pediatric intensivist working in Israel, and prior to that in SickKids in Toronto, where this work was done. Prior to being a physician, I did a PhD and a postdoc in neuroscience, studying networks of neuronal networks, but real neurons, not artificial ones. So brain injury is relatively common in the pediatric age group, with traumatic brain injury being the leading cause of death in children and young adults. Many of these children end up in the ICU with reduced level of consciousness, basically being comatose, either because of the injury, the severity of the injury, or because of sedation and drugs. And we know as we follow these children that secondary injuries that happen throughout their stay in the ICU play a major role in determining their outcome. And ideally, if we could detect early on these secondary deteriorations, we could prevent harm. Currently, in the state that we are in intensive care, we have no good way to know what's the internal brain state of these patients. We don't know what's going on inside their brains as they're lying in the ICU. And this was exactly the goal of this study, to try and fill that gap by developing and testing a setup that will allow us at the bedside, online, to actually tease out the internal brain state, the brain activation patterns, and from that maybe guide treatment and prevent deterioration. So this is what the setup looks like. It's actually built with 3 components. One is an off-the-shelf research high-density EEG, which can record from 64 electrodes at the rate of up to 5 kilohertz. The second one is an in-house built stimulation system, which basically delivers computer-controlled stimuli to 3 sensory modalities, either visual, somatosensory, stimulating the median nerve, or auditory, which we used either simple stimuli or more complex stimuli with names, trying to tease out some higher level cortical processing. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see a patient in the ICU, a very noisy environment. The patient is comatose, she's being ventilated, and recorded with our setup at the same time. And on the bottom middle side, you can see what it looks like. So these are average waveforms of the EEG recording in response to different stimulation types. And the third part of the system, that's where the computationally intensive or the machine learning part happens, is an algorithmic part basically designed to solve the inverse problem. So we want to switch from 2D electrical recordings actually to a 3D brain activation patterns, which you can see on the lower right. And this is what it looks like on average in our healthy controls. So for example, for somatosensory stimulation, so we can see that when we stimulate the right arm, you can see activation in the left somatosensory cortex, and vice versa for the other arm. For visual stimulation, we can see the visual cortex lights up. And for auditory stimulation, we could show that the auditory cortices will light up, but for example, when the patient hears their own name, we can actually see even differential activation, which is some kind of evidence for higher level processing. So we use this setup with an idea of having an automated system in the future. So we could show that we can quantify exactly the regional activation in functional areas of the brain. So switching from an EEG electrode to which areas of the brain are active and how much are they active. We could show that it might be feasible as an online monitor on the timescales of minutes around. And last but not least, we try to correlate the anatomical injury to the functional brain imaging. So we had patients in the ICU who had distinct anatomical lesions, either due to trauma, a stroke, or a brain bleed, and we had their MRIs, and we could use that MRI to automatically segment their brain. And also we used our setup to image their brain activation patterns as they were in the ICU, and then we could try to correlate, to transpose the two into what's the correlation between anatomy and function. For example, on the lower panel, you can see the brain activation patterns as overlaid on the patient's MRI. So what's next? So we've shown as a proof of concept that such a system is feasible. The next stages would try to make it into an actual product. So first, we would like to simplify the setup. So right now we have a setup that's quite cumbersome. It requires 60 electrodes with that thing that looks like a cap. Ideally, we would like to reduce the number of recording electrodes with minimal loss of information and diagnostic potential. We would like or need to enable real-time fast analysis. And for that, we need to reduce the dimensionality, ideally by machine learning algorithms. And we'd like to automate the detection functionality of the system, ideally with some supervised classification algorithms, such as SVM or something else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. You didn't mention which algorithms you used.
Well, so there's a bunch of algorithms that you can use. We tested several, Beamformer. In the end, we ended up using S-Loretta, which was the fastest one if we think about actually enabling this in a real online environment.
And do you have any ideas regarding more? You mentioned that you need in the next stage more training, more machine learning, things like that. Which alley would you pursue?
Well, it depends for what. For them, well, dimensionality reduction, then we need to test, right? It can either be some of the linear algorithms, or something more complex, such as manifold learning. For automating any supervised algorithms will do. I don't know why I haven't tried deep learning, but I guess that's always, you can throw these, because huge amounts of data in the end, right? From a single patient, you get, hundreds of thousands of data points or more, right? Millions of data points. So ideally, I would like to reduce the dimensionality first and then throw it on any, given algorithm.
Okay, question?
Have you started mapping this with long-term outcomes?
No, so this was just the first proof of concept study where we had 15 subjects. Ideally, I would like to also switch, these are all children, because as a pediatric intensivist, but we would like to see that in the adult world as well. This is, in the future.
Yeah, how much of your data is attributed to noise?
Well, there's several types of noise, right? First of all, an EEG in general is a very noisy measurement. They're very noisy and highly correlated, because in the end, a single EEG electrode records from millions of neurons. They're being transferred through, the skull, which filters it quite a lot. So we can, as sources of noise, just offhand, there's internal sources of noise. I mean, the patient is being bombarded by stimuli, but at the same time, the nurses bug them. They're in pain, they're uncomfortable. There's lots of processes going in that add in that noise. And there's the external noise, because we work in a very noisy, not just loud, but noisy environment in the ICU. It turns out, so one of the ways to deal with noise is via your algorithm. Another one is with your repetitions. So each stimulus is being repeated several times. And by averaging out, at least we average out things that are not related to the stimulus itself. It turns out that in children, evoked potentials are very, the signal-to-noise ratio is quite good, actually. I think it's less in adults, but I haven't quantified it yet.
So, very good job, Danny. It's something that's pretty intuitive and potentially very valuable clinically. Assessing the potential brain injury in a kid that's in the ICU can be a problematic challenge. Two questions. The first is, you showed kind of the averaged data and showed how that, the signal can be mapped into a change. I'm curious to know about individual variability in that population and, what kinds of signals that you actually see in kids that do evolve some kind of process, and sedation would be another piece of this, is how does sedation affect this?
So going into the study, we had a lot of unknowns. Sedation was one of the big ones. We know sedation changes the overall EEG patterns, but we were happily surprised to see that when you look at evoked potentials, when you've got a stimulus that's time-locked and you average, you can average out quite a lot of that noise in a sense. And actually, even in heavily sedated children, we could get quite good signals. Second, we chose stimuli that could be delivered to children who are in the ICU and comatose, right? So the visual, for example, wasn't some film, it was light flashes that even with closed eyes could generate a signal. And the variability, so it depends on what resolution of things you want to see. If you want to see which areas of the brain are active, then that's pretty easy to do even in an ICU environment. The last slide we showed was, we were wondering what's the difference between anatomical injury and functional injury, right? Because you can have areas of the brain that look terrible on CT, but we know as physicians that down the road, these areas will recover. So it was really interesting to see what's the difference between anatomy and function. But in order to actually have a good answer as to say what will be the prognosis long time, we need more subjects, obviously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have an area of precision medicine and drug discovery. Alan Batter won the competition, but he couldn't make it, so the abstract will be presented by Nathaniel Gatan. Nathaniel?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So they apologized for me on behalf of Alon already, so I'll apologize for the Israeli accent before I start. Okay, so as humans, we want to make order in chaos, and we want to maybe understand systems deeply. And for understanding systems, this is an action that requires intelligence. And this is why I want to show you why integrating artificial intelligence in our everyday work might help us understand complex systems at the level of the system itself. And we focused on hypertension, or essential hypertension. So hypertension is a condition that affects over 1 billion people around the world. Its significance results from its association with other illnesses, so for example, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, diabetes, and hypertension is a complex trait disease, right? It's caused by the interaction of a lot of different contributing genetic factors. And that makes it naturally very hard to understand. So that's why I want to show you in 4 very short slides, maybe how machine learning can help us gain a deeper understanding of the system. Okay, so we started our analysis with a large database of genes. And using text mining techniques, we narrowed down this large database into a small group of 200 genes that are associated with hypertension. Then we applied unsupervised machine learning algorithms in order to create a topological view, a graph network of genes and the interactions between them. Then we clustered genes together and in a way that coincided with the pathways that the genes belong to. So for example, on the left-hand side, you can see this graph, and the areas that are encircled in orange represent genes whose effect on hypertension is mediated through the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. And this is actually a very nice story. One of basically the leading expert in hypertension in Israel, Professor Ehud Grossman at the Sheba Medical Center, has been telling us for years that he expects us to find hypertension as a complex trait disease. He warned us about the fact that it's going to be very hard to treat with time. And he was basically relieved to look and realize that the computational results corroborate what his personal experience in the clinic told him already. So this already gives us a very nice validation to what we see every day. Next, we wanted to look at the different components within the network. So we started out with the regulatory components of the network. We used sequence alignment techniques to find out what were the most enriched regulatory components in this network. And we found 2 types, so, and they're projected on this network. So in blue, we see the SP1 transcription factor, and in green and red, we see 2 types of very famous microRNA molecules. And there's 2 interesting realizations, I think, in this result. So first, we see on the left-hand side, maybe you can see it this way better, that the regulatory components are spread, are distributed all over the network. They're not confined to any neighborhood or pathway. And the second is that it's interesting to see that the effect is along the information flow. So we see regulation at the level of transcription from DNA to mRNA, and we also see regulation at the post-transcriptional phase. So this is already interesting. But what's maybe more interesting is the centrality of different components. So not all components are created equal. Some components are more central than others, which means that if we take them out of the network might collapse, which might mark them as targets for maybe research or treatment. So mapping in this inset, encircled in orange, the redder the dot is and the larger it is, the more central it is within the network. And this huge red dot that pops out in the middle, that's insulin. And that maybe draws a very logical link between hypertension, essential hypertension, and the metabolic syndrome. All right, so we see a very large and maybe even complex and monstrous kind of network. And how did this network came to be? Why is it like that? Why is it that complex? And so as biomedical researchers, as physicians, as medical doctors, we already know that answers to this kind of question usually tends to be because it had some sort of evolutionary advantage a long time. So to look at the evolutionary development across time, we went and looked at orthologs, which basically means that for every gene within our 200 gene bank, we compare it to the parallel gene in other species. Okay, so for example, I take the insulin sequence and I compare it to the same gene in maybe fish and rodents and primates, and I look at the conservation of those genes along time, how the sequence changes. And then applying, once again, unsupervised machine learning on that, called, in this case, hierarchical clustering, we can create a phylogenetic tree that tells us how genes go together. So in this case, we can see that we move from the less complex to the more complex, but also, maybe more interesting, we can see that genes are sorted according to their conservation along evolution, and that fits with how the network is organized. So maybe we have a complex system, so we have an explanation that arose due to the fact that components in the system tend to co-evolve together and then start interacting, and maybe that's the reason it's complex. So lastly, after millions of years of evolution, man arrived, created drugs to treat the patients, but unfortunately created two types of drugs, either drugs that affect those genes because it treats hypertension, but maybe drugs that actually cause hypertension as a side effect, and that's why they affect those genes. So when we look at those two groups, we trained a supervised machine learning algorithm to predict whether unknown genes are going to be maybe implicated in side effects, and then looked at the insights we got from that and saw that there are very enriched families of drugs within this group. So for a short example, we see antidepressants, anti-diabetic drugs, anti-inflammatory drugs, and I think the common denominator for all those families is the fact that they're not one-shot, one-kill medicine, right? It's not paracetamol, it's not ibuprofen. It's something we give our patients every day for years to treat something else, and that means that we immediately put them at risk for developing hypertension later in life. So maybe that's an interesting realization. So maybe to sum up, those are mainly summary in the terms of what we understood biologically, but I think there's two take-home messages in this case. First is that machine learning can help us with validation to what physicians really see every day within their clinics when they're talking with patients. But I think the second interesting realization is the fact that it can give us maybe a mechanistic explanation to why things they are as they are, and maybe give us some clues about the direction we need to take in order to develop more effective treatments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just a full disclosure here, Nathan is a friend and a colleague in our program, and thank you for replacing Alon and for coming up to California on a short notice. So sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, question.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. That's really exciting work you're doing. I was wondering, for the initial tree, what was the inputs into the machine learning? I mean, was it numbers? Was it a chart of mechanisms of action? Was it, like, how did you know that the different proteins were connected to each other?
Okay, so this is a good question. I have to say right off the bat for all the questions, this is Alon's work. I did my best to complete everything I know about it, and I promise whatever I can't answer, I'll check it out and I'll get back to you. In this case, I actually know what the answer could be. You could take, no, seriously, it's quite easy. What you saw there, the edges of this graph were not weighted. That means that as long as an edge exists, that means that there's some sort of interaction. In this case, it was protein-protein interaction. And when you have this sort of matrix of zeros and one, this is the input, whether there is an interaction or not the magnitude of the interaction. And then you activate unsupervised machine learning algorithms on this, in this case, a very simple clustering algorithm that can create a tree of that.
But the interaction, what format of initial data did you put into it? I mean, like what, I don't know if...
if it's a knowledge database. We base it on articles, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so text mining, that's why I said it in the beginning.
That's what I was trying to understand, is if it was just a whole bunch of text mining, or if you had
it was text mining. We extracted the matrix from that, and that was an input, yeah.
What are you guys thinking about from machine learning model improvement?
What do we think?
What for your future state? So I saw a clustering method here, right? So right now, what is the next generation of your algorithm or additional algorithm you guys are thinking about putting?
So, okay, so there's a lot of information that wasn't presented here, but I think what would be interesting is to use maybe unsupervised machine learning algorithms in order to see patterns that we don't already see. So supervised learning is very, very famous, very popular. We try to maybe find relations between things that we still don't understand. But I think, to me, more interesting, I want to see more unsupervised learning taken in the future, because there's a lot of data. Collecting data is maybe a challenge, but understanding data is a bigger challenge. And I think unsupervised learning has an ability, an amazing ability, to show us patterns that we don't usually see and get better insights.
A quick continuation of the first question. You talked about a knowledge base, and then you talked about text mining. What kind of text was that? I mean, it was the literature, or so it was from PubMed or some other source?
Yeah, so it was literature, published literature, and we used text mining techniques in order to find
the 200 or so.
Exactly, whether interactions between those proteins exist or not, and of course, at some level of confidence, whether it exists or not. So it's not just any mention, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
And do you know which corpus of literature was that?
No, I can't answer that.
Okay.
Not right now.
In terms of the omics data, what sample size do you think you need, and how do you safeguard against overfitting?
Okay, so this is a good question. I think it's a good question not only in this context, but in any context of machine learning. So overfitting is a real problem, especially, by the way, if you do supervised machine learning that is deep learning. People tend to want to see accuracy, and eventually you overfit for the training set. So there are a lot of different methods to take care of that. One of the most famous ones is called just regularization. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Usually what you do, you tell the machine learning algorithm that it's going to get penalty for every time it modifies a weight or a parameter. So you're essentially telling the algorithm, listen, you can do what you need to do in order to become more accurate, but the more actions you're going to do, I'm going to give you penalty. So sort of like the reinforcement learning from before. And when you do that, they tend to converge into solutions that are that are smoother, that are less overfitted. So you should look into regularization.
Quick question. Do you feel this work can be translated outside of hypertension?
Absolutely. Yeah, hypertension in this case is just an example. We're data people. Of course, we're interested more in biological data, but it can apply to a lot of other complex trait diseases, and I think most of what we know today is not monogenic. I mean,
great.
So yeah.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're at the halfway mark of the abstract presentations. I just want to pause here and thank our judging panel and the panel up here for the hard work. They graded 96 abstracts. So can we just give them a round of applause, please? All right. And then the winning abstract for the cloud computing and big data section is Hisham El-Askari, but the presenter will be Nick LaHaye. Nick?
Hi, my name is Nick LaHaye. I'm a PhD student at Chapman University and also a software engineer and data scientist at JPL. So I'm here to talk to you today about potential predictors of Kawasaki outbreak using deep learning. So Kawasaki disease, as many of you probably know, is a serious illness that affects blood vessels. It can cause permanent heart damage as well as death. It affects children. And causality, as of right now, is pretty puzzling. There's been some recent findings using earth science data that the winds, there's seasonal winds in northeast China, and some correlation between the Kawasaki outbreaks in Japan and the seasonal winds and also dust events. They found that some Candida fungus, which is known to cause other illnesses and issues with health, is found in these dust events, and they believe that there's a strong connection there. So what our idea is to use remote sensing and geostationary data for aerosol characteristics in order to predict Kawasaki disease outbreak. So this is the initial data we found for Kawasaki disease outbreaks. As I mentioned later, we need some more fine-grained data and some newer data in order to train some of our models. But as you can see, there's lots of outbreaks in the winter and parts of spring, and kind of valleys or low level of outbreaks during the summer. So our case study is centralized around Northeast China and Japan because that's where all of the studies about the seasonal winds occur. So kind of cut off. So our first thought is that we need to be able to track these dust events. So we can do this using aerosol characteristics. This slide and the next slide are done using MODIS data. MODIS is a Earth-facing imager. There's actually 2 instruments on 2 separate satellites, and they've been orbiting Earth for about 16 years. These plots here are aerosol optical depth. So what it measures is the amount of light extinction due to intersection with aerosol clouds. So as you can see, this is tracking over Northeast China and Japan. So 1 is the top left, and the 4th one is the last period in time. You can kind of see the dust cloud as it moves along kind of in a northeast direction. So next, what we looked at are some more aerosol characteristics for the time period that we had the Kawasaki data outbreak in a kind of coarse grain data. So we looked at the monthly product of the MODIS to find first angstrom exponent. And the angstrom exponent has an inverse relation to the fineness of a particle. And what that means is when aerosol plumes travel long distances, the ones that tend to stay in the air over long periods of time are fine and very small. So we want to make sure we can track fine, small particles. And so this first plot, this plot to the left, A, B, C, and D, track the angstrom exponent over this region at the bottom here. Where's the pointer? So the bottom graph that has the region boxed, the 3 regions are there because MODIS tracks the angstrom exponent over different wavelengths over both land and ocean. So we had to use different wavelengths, but we can still track the plume events, the dust events over time. So A shows us the over Northeast China, the angstrom exponent, and we can see that there are some peaks in the winter, and it kind of transports over to B and C, which are in region 2 over ocean. And so the x-axis is longitude, the y-axis is time, and the contour itself is angstrom exponent. And we can track these peaks, the kind of the yellow to red values over time as we go. And the other plot is fine mode fraction, so it's the amount of fine particles in a dust plume in comparison to the total amount of aerosols for a specific spot. So again, we can see the seasonal trends where the peaks occur in the winter and the spring, and in the summer, the values are very low, showing that while there may be dust events, they're all local, and they're not really transported over ocean or over long distances. So because the Earth-observing satellites orbit, they only go over these areas every few days or so. So what we wanted to do was look at geostationary data, so ground-based data. And there is a web of sensors, actually globally now, that measures aerosol characteristics called AeroNet. And so we used these 3 noted at the top left, Sekal, which is kind of right by the desert where we would expect dust to come from. This one in kind of at the coast of China, and then one in Japan. Unfortunately, because of the time, this is kind of when AeroNet was first starting out in Asia, and the data is kind of sparse itself, and there's not as many stations as there are today. So one of my recommendations for future work is to bring newer data so we can get a kind of larger data set. But this data here, as I said, is sparse, so it's kind of hard to track. But we looked at volume concentration again to see what radii of aerosols are going long distances. We looked at the summer as well, and as you can see, it's very sparse, unfortunately. So our next step is to feed all of this data once we get a larger data set into a deep learning architecture. And on the right here is some previous work from some colleagues that used the same type of architecture to predict precipitation. But future work is to get more ground data and newer data so we can have a finer grained data set and then test and train some deep learning architectures.
Thank you very much. Quick note. So this is big data and cloud computing. So big data you had,
Yes.
and clouds you also had in some sort.
Correct.
All right. Question.
So Nick, we've seen a lot of collaborations between physicians and data scientists. I think yours is the first example of a climate science medical collaboration. How did you as climate scientists get involved with addressing a medical issue like this?
So Dr. Elisgari actually approached me, and he was approached by a physician who was interested in the issue. And I know that the research is rather recent, and there's a few papers and a few collaborations. I'm not sure exactly how the collaboration first began, but I know that it's a more prevalent thing as they're finding this relation in China.
Great talk. I really like how it's connecting health with the environment. I was wondering for the Kawasaki disease data, what's the source of that? Because I would imagine there's not necessarily robust ways to collect the epidemiology and the number of outbreaks. And then a corollary to that question is, have you considered doing this for looking at asthma, asthma attacks or outbreaks like, bird flu, SARS, those kind of use cases?
Yeah, so I know this is pretty initial in terms of our study. The Kawasaki disease outbreak data is pretty hard to find. We found a few publications on the epidemiology over time, specifically from some scientists in Japan. We are not sure about how we're going to go about finding our fine-grained data, but that's kind of our next challenge. In terms of other diseases or issues, health issues, I think it definitely can be applied. And there's some kind of newer satellites, instruments on satellites that are actually targeting those specific health concerns, the actual particles that cause pollution. So yeah, definitely in the future it can be.
So I'd like to thank you for exposing some of my ignorance in medicine, actually. I had no idea that there was an association between these patterns with Kawasaki's disease in the literature. Anthony probably knows this because he's a little closer to Kawasaki's, but it's an interesting pattern, but it doesn't necessarily assume that it's the dust that causes it, because there's many examples to where if you look at cold can cause the flu, but also the influenza virus grows during the cold, and you linked it to coccidioidomycosis as well. But I'm curious to know why you're focused necessarily on Kawasaki's, because going to the point of asthma, if you haven't truly linked the data yet, it seems like it would start off as an unconstrained problem, and then that association would come up.
Yeah. So I think the idea sprung from, first off, a lack of understanding of causality, and also that these other studies have found strong correlations between the two. And it's not necessarily the dust, so I didn't explain this, I didn't have time, but the dust transport just acts as a protection from UV radiation for the fungus itself, which is thought to have the strong correlation for causality. Because the fungus itself is, while minorly UV resistant, it's probably not able to transport long distances without some kind of protection like dust. So the dust events are kind of our hypothesis on how it travels long distances. In terms of applying it to other things, I think it's definitely a good idea, a good recommendation from a few of you guys, and I think I'll recommend it to my colleagues going forward, but yeah.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just following on from Wen, I think there's a lot of work on spatiotemporal modeling in infectious diseases for outbreaks, and so I think you'll find some really good parallels there for you. And the beauty of a lot of those other diseases is there's a lot of phenotype and genotype data that's spatially and temporally located, so maybe this application will work even better in some other infectious diseases.
Okay.
My ignorance is wide open. You didn't. Does Kawasaki show up in other parts of the world? And if yes, could this work be transported and studied over there where maybe those fungi don't exist?
Yeah, so if the same type of stuff exists, so the idea is that we can track the dust better than we can track the fungus, and since we know how to track the dust and the dust events occur coincidentally with the outbreaks, that's what we're tracking. So if the same environment or same variables occur elsewhere, we can definitely apply the same thing, or if the variables are different, obviously we can change the parameters to the model, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The section on digital medicine and wearable technology, the winner is Raghu Bala. Raghu?
Hi, folks. Thanks for having me. So we're going to talk about the use of IoT in medicine. So as many of you might have heard, IoT is extremely popular in the press these days, Internet of Things, and there are a lot of applications in medicine. So I'm the CEO of NetObjects. We are a Orange County-based IoT platform company. And I'm also the co-founder of CliniTrack, which is a company that I co-founded with a physician who's the chief medical officer. And we were trying to explore the use of IoT in various medical and healthcare applications. So we went into trying to use IoT in medicine, and our inspiration initially came from Dilbert, of all places. So if Dilbert is talking about radiation dosimetry, then it's in the mainstream, it was our opinion. So joking aside, radiation exposure is pretty serious, and there are some mandates from the JCHO, oops, sorry about that, that talk about the different types of problems. And actually, it's a very undetected problem in many healthcare facilities. And the current solutions are kind of they have some room for improvement, and IoT can bring about that improvement. So first of all, before we jump into IoT itself, I think in medicine there's a lot of use of sensors, and sensors, are I would say the main constructs and the edge of the IoT infrastructure. So you talk about edge devices, sensors form the key component in that area, and we are using sensors in medicine for a long time, thermometers, blood pressure monitors, and so on. And the point that we're trying to make here is how do we use IoT to solve some healthcare problems? And radiation dosimetry is just one example, but there are many applications. And the idea is to collect data in real time and then have some real-time actuation. That means you take the data in real time and do something with it. And that decision-making is what we're trying to solve with this particular solution. So in terms of how we started, we've developed a smart radiation dosimeter. It's an active dosimeter, unlike the passive dosimeters that you find in most healthcare facilities. And what it does is it's got the advantage of doing cumulative readings and in any sort of time frame. So currently what's happening, the status quo in many healthcare facilities is they are using 30 to 60-day time cycles to measure radiation exposure. And this is, I'm talking about healthcare workers. But then the same sort of problem, this solution actually has got some clinical applications as well. We'll cover that in a second. So what happens is in a 30-day, 60-day cycle, the dosimeter that is used is actually a chemical-based dosimeter. It's sent to a facility, they do readings, and you get back the data. And in our kind of, I would say, a non-scientific study in terms of interviewing people, we found that most radiation departments, a lot of people actually don't even wear the badges in the first place, which is terrible. But a lot of them don't even know how much exposure they've had during any period of time. That's because the data comes back in paper, it's not recorded in the cloud, there's no statistics, there's no proper record keeping at all. So we solved that problem because we store everything in real time in the cloud, and we can give you any sort of reading over any time window that you choose, 1 year, 30 days, 60 days, and so on. The other advantage is because it's real time. Let's say that you are exposed to high degrees of radiation at a particular point. In fact, we were at a trade show maybe a couple of months ago, and someone came up to us and they said that, do you know that among physicians, there's a lot of left-sided brain tumors for those who do certain types of procedures using fluoroscopes. And that's because even, I didn't know about that, but that's an example where if there's some real-time exposure, you can take some action immediately because the device itself is an edge device. It's got some intelligence on the device itself that can immediately indicate some dangerous conditions. But apart from that, once it's stored in the cloud, you can take a kind of a cumulative data set across multiple devices and so on to form a sort of an opinion on throttling certain things. One of the advantages is got location awareness. So we use a combination of a nuclear sensor and an ultra-wideband chip to find out location. So in a healthcare facility, those operating healthcare facilities will know this. If you get, let's say, insurance liability exposure. So if someone standing next to an X-ray machine is getting some exposure, there's a kind of a liability on the hospital or healthcare facilities part. But then if someone is very far away and does not even come near that particular space, you'd like to know about that. So we record the distance within 10 centimeter accuracy. Like I mentioned before, it's cloud-enabled. It's a wearable platform. And it comes with a companion app. So one issue that we found is a lot of, oops, I'm running out of time, I'll move a bit faster. So doctors, sometimes they go around in remote locations. Some are consulting physicians and so on. So they need a Bluetooth low energy version of this device. So a dosimeter itself looks something like this. And that's your radiation sensor, which is shielded for ultra-wideband. And then that's the ultra-wideband communication device. And then this is the underlying platform that powers the Internet of Things platform that powers this whole solution. And then it's got a number of functionality, including predictive analytics and actuation. And then some analytics to find out what goes on and so on. So in conclusion, it's faster turnaround time for readings. You can learn from past trends, and then the health benefits as well as liability benefits for the hospitals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a short question. So you talked about that it is a cumulative data and it is location aware. So let me ask you from a data science point of view. Have you thought about taking other kinds of just harnessing and enjoying the fact that you have a device? Maybe you can also collect other kinds of data or the same kinds of data, but make additional insights. I'm thinking about things like, I don't know, maybe mood, and what is the implications about mood. Have you thought about something like that?
So it depends. I mean, like, I didn't look at mood data, but let's say that we use it in a clinical setting. Let's imagine that we are using this device for, we were approached by Loma Linda Hospital, who said that, this could be really useful for radiation, oncology, okay? In that kind of a case, the dosimeter can measure the exposure that a particular patient received. But then we can merge that data in the back end with all kinds of other things, which might be, things about, let's say, whether they come from a particular, a race profile, or they live in a particular part of the country or whatnot. And we can merge all of that data to form a better opinion, a 360 view on that particular patient, as opposed to only the data that we collect from them through a sensor. So we can do those types of things, and that will be the next step to kind of extrapolate from what the sensory data says to us.
IoT normally is also used for monitoring equipment, right? So
Yes.
one, it's great for patient safety, but that's kind of after the fact when radiation is actually going up already.
Yes.
Have you thought about using it from a preventive standpoint where you're looking at the equipment breakage?
Yes. So
and
the
looking at the micro anomalies there before something happens?
So that's a good question. So actually the same type of thing that we put as a wearable on a human, we can actually take that same technology and implant it in the equipment itself to figure out if it is irradiating too much, if it's going beyond a certain threshold and stuff like that. So we can absolutely put it on the machine itself as opposed to putting it on the human. So.
Have you thought about any of the risks that might be there for actually knowing this information and not acting upon it? So having that information discoverable and then someone makes some type of a claim that they've been exposed.
So that's a good question again. So there are a couple of things. Once we collect the data in the platform, it comes in the form of a payload. That payload, for those who are in software, you'll know it's a JSON payload. It's an unstructured data payload. Now we inspect that payload to figure out if there's something going on immediately, okay? So there are 5 outcomes there. The first outcome is we can store the data and do analytics just the normal way. That's number one. You can do predictive analytics and so on, okay? Number 2, you can do actuation. That means act on the data immediately and inform something. It can inform a device, it can inform, and then we can also do notifications, alerts to, let's say, the building administrator, facilities person, or whatnot, or the person himself saying that you are exposed currently, do something about it. Number 4 is we can hook into EMR system through our enterprise gateway. And number 5 is actually something that I think will happen very soon in the following years. We're actually storing the data into a blockchain. So blockchain is a very good way of sharing data if there are multiple constituents who need to look at the data. It's a kind of a cryptographic storage. And you can have things like smart contracts act on the data. So that's something that we are going to extend into in the coming year.
Hi, I think it's great that you're using IoT to track staff and improve occupational safety. I actually have 3 questions that sound unrelated, but they're actually related. My first question is, how does this process actually use big data or machine learning? And then, okay, I'll be quick. I'll be quick. Well, I could have asked my question in the last 10 seconds.
How about I've got one?
How is this actually using machine learning and big data? And then how are you transmitting that data, from the device to your systems?
So we actually, when the data comes in, we actually store it in a big data software system. And currently we are using something called Elasticsearch, which is unstructured data. We can store large gobs of information in it. And then we run analytics against that data. And then the analytics could be in the form of reports. It could be in the form of actuation. It could be numerous outcomes that can come out of that data. So we are taking the data and storing it. And then in big data, you can do things like map reduce. You can do a number of steps. It depends on what method you want to use the data. Right now, our rules processing is very simple. It's a very simple if this, then that type rules processing. But we are trying to inject something called Amazon Lambda. For example, you can put custom rules processing in there to act on the data and so on. So,
Thank you.
Anthony, forgive me, I'm going to chase him off the stage with one final comment, is that might actually need to go to the patient as much as it does to the caregiver, so that we'll think twice before we order another CT scan on somebody.
Okay, thank you. And our last category is robotic technology and virtual assistants. And the winner of this section is Adam Kalawi. Adam?
Thank you. Where's the clicker? Perfect. So my name's Adam Kalawi. I'm a third-year medical student at UC Irvine. So it's kind of nice to be one of the medical students up here, being able to represent and show, we are still trying to encourage artificial intelligence education in medical school. So my project was a project concept called BetterMD. It's basically a virtual assistance tool to promote lifelong learning among physicians. And before I get started, just to outline my talk, I'll briefly talk about a problem that I've seen in medical education. I'll discuss some of the challenges that I've seen making that more difficult, and then I'll end with my proposed solution. So this is a picture of my class shortly after we first got our white coats. We're all super eager to become great physicians someday. And as we are getting closer and closer to applying for residency and finishing up our undergraduate medical education, I've been reflecting a lot on what exactly makes a great physician great. It's kind of an esoteric question to think about. It's a little bit easier when you think about it in terms of what are some qualities that you see in a great physician. So you'd expect a great physician to be knowledgeable. You'd want them to kind of understand the entire body of literature in their field and understand all the underlying theories. You'd want them to be skillful. So you'd want them to fully understand the physical exams that are required in their field and all the procedural skills that they need. You'd hope that they'd be kind and show compassion to all individuals that they treat regardless of background. And you'd also expect them to be professional and hold ethics and standards at a very high level. So the next big thing that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we become great physicians? And I think the historian Will Durant described this best when he was actually reviewing some of Aristotle's work, when he said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. So in applying that notion to medicine, I think the key, really, to becoming a great physician is practicing and growing every single day, lifelong learning. So, that's great. We all would hope that every physician's learning every day and working very hard. But the reality of the situation is our current medical landscape doesn't really give you the protected time to do that on a regular basis. I think Rob High mentioned yesterday that the average clinician has about 5 hours per month to continue their education, continue their learning, and keep up with the literature. Yet, as we've seen today, there's so much new information in so many new fields. Artificial intelligence is just one of them, but every field has a tremendous body of literature coming out every day. So it's hard to determine what a physician should really focus on. And I think that's kind of where BetterMD comes in. So here's my idea. It's a little complex diagram, but we'll walk you through it. So my end goal is for a physician to be able to have just a daily educational task, so they don't have to comb through a whole body of literature and decide what they want to study, but instead are just given a project to do that day. This allows the physician to complete their lifelong learning objectives in 15 to 30 minutes a day, rather than 30 minutes to an hour of just searching for what they want to learn. So how could we do this? So on the input side of things, we could take into account clinician preferences, some biographical data about them, as well as EMR input about the types of patients that they see, the types of situations that they come across. Put that into an intelligent algorithm that's sort of weighing and figuring out who this physician really is. Query a content database to kind of ping down some information about what a good learning objective for this individual might be. And then finally, allow the clinician to access this daily educational task through a virtual assistant. The reason I think a virtual assistant UI would be ideal in this situation is, one, it kind of declutters the whole process. You know, all of this back-end stuff can be a black box that the physician doesn't have to worry about. And instead, they could just say, I have 15 or 30 minutes to study today. What can you give me? And then also, I think we discussed a bit yesterday that voices and personification is really tied to emotion. So this can kind of give a physician a sense of accountability and someone that they're kind of reporting back to. Also, in the computer science world, some people use what's called the rubber ducky method. For those of you that are on the clinical side of things, it's basically where you put an inanimate object, historically a rubber ducky, on a table and explain your thought process to it when you're stuck in a line of code. I think this kind of virtual assistant UI would be useful in that you can have someone that you can be explaining your thought process to as you're going through all this new material. So if I really had to boil down my talk into a one-liner, one takeaway, I think it's kind of silly that Facebook and Google are able to take a large amount of information that I'm not truly voluntarily giving and provide me with a nice, beautiful, targeted ad. And yet we haven't yet figured out a way in medical education to take information that we'd be willing to give and provide clinicians with daily learning material that fits with their lifelong learning objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Question?
Yeah, so I've had the chance to build these kind of intelligent virtual agents before, nurses and doctors and things. It's a fun thing to do, right? So what makes a great doctor is usually not sometimes the knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. The knowledge is actually secondary. What makes a great doctor are the soft skills and the bedside manners. What are you thinking about in your product in terms of how you're going to incorporate that?
Absolutely. In some of my rehearsals, I addressed this a little bit more, but I knew timing would probably be an issue, so I cut some of that out. I think knowledge and skills are kind of the low-hanging fruit in this arena, but definitely the soft skills are a major component for any physician. I think that's going to become more and more relevant as artificial intelligence starts to augment physician practice. You're not going to necessarily be amazed when a physician's able to come up with a large differential diagnosis, because in the future, I think computer systems are going to be able to help with that significantly. But you are going to be amazed when your physician is someone that's coming to the bedside late at night and able to answer some questions with a high degree of empathy. I don't think this product addresses that issue, but I think there's a tremendous amount of work being done in virtual reality and augmented reality to address those issues.
In your schematic, the virtual assistant was showing a bunch of papers to the doctor. Do you think that the best way is to suggest the papers from the literature or cases and the doctor to study them, or the virtual assistant to even summarize in a targeted way what the virtual assistant thinks the doctor will be most interested in the limited time he or she will have, and just pass that on?
That's an excellent question as well. So the reason I put up this schematic is because I think it's very scalable as technology advances and as we progress. So in the current here and now, I don't think it's completely infeasible to picture how this could be done today. Maybe in a little bit more of a rudimentary manner, but it could certainly be done. In the future, as we start to progress more and more and we're able to develop artificial intelligence that's really able to concretely summarize this data down to the key bare bone points, I think that would be a wonderful application and would further free up time for clinicians to learn.
I can feel the future coming fast. Sometimes we need to learn things not that we choose to learn, but that we need to hear and we don't want to hear. How does this connect to what we know already works in terms of education, which is feedback on performance compared to your cohorts? You've mentioned the AHR as an input there. So are you going to be targeting messages people need to hear?
That brings up another wonderful point, I think. So when you're in practice, at least I've seen this a number of times with some physicians that are getting closer and closer to retirement, your daily practice tends to kind of be self-reaffirming. So you tend to live in a little bit of an echo chamber. I did this before, it worked out pretty well, so I will continue to do this. Hopefully with something like this, you'll kind of inadvertently take information that a clinician needs to hear, but isn't necessarily realizing that they need to hear, and presenting it to them on a regular basis. So kind of breaking the echo chamber a little bit and throwing in some new information.
So, I mean, as a physician, most of the learning that I do now is actually collaborative learning. So I actually learn from the nurses, learn from the medical students, learn from the data scientists. How do you incorporate collaborative learning in the vision that you have?
That's a wonderful question. I hadn't given that too much thought yet. If I had to quickly answer on the spot, I think the best way to do that would be to start to incorporate information from a wide breadth of fields. So, we as clinicians might say, okay, I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I will, read journals specifically focused on that. But who's to say that we can't pull information from other fields? And, who's to say that our daily educational task has to be a concrete, let's read this. It could be, have a conversation with your nurse about what her daily life is like. That is a daily educational task, right?
And learning is so much more effective if it's within a social context. So, and how do you put that into your system?
Sure. So there could be a social networking aspect to this. There's a number of social networking platforms for physicians like LinkedIn and Doximity. So you could, in theory, tie in this kind of product with a network of physicians. You could even gamify it if you'd like and sort of see who's actually keeping up on their daily educational tasks and who's really progressing the most.
Thank you. Congratulations to all the winners.
Wow, just overwhelmed with the quality of the abstracts overall, actually. And then the 6 winning abstracts are just absolutely outstanding. For the first meeting in this area, I'm just pleasantly surprised at the caliber of the abstracts, and I think the judges are too, based on your feedback. So we're a little bit more than the halfway mark of the meeting. I think it's appropriate to thank the many people behind me that are executing the meeting. And I want to first thank Mijanu Pham. Can you stand up? We have the lights up. And the MI3, the Institute team that helps to run this meeting. We have Laura and Saraya. And the CME team, is Mary and Marissa here? They're not here. The CME team, and then our AV team in the back. And Brett, who is helping. So it's many people behind the scenes to trying to execute this as well as we can. So I'd like to thank everybody. We'll have a break for lunch. It's a nice 2-hour break. I don't know what the weather's like out there, but I think it's pretty good. Warmer, at least, than where some of you are from. So thank you again.